What happened between Mr. Duncan Matlock and myself is private and between us alone.
Do you want me to beg?
I'll do it. It lasted the best part of a year. If the press hadn't rumbled him, he'd still be seeing her. He's infatuated with her.
Channel 4's award-winning drama The Politician's Wife starts Tuesday at 9 on 4.
On 4 now, just what was it that 20 years ago led to Harold Wilson's shock resignation? Secret History unravels the mystery of his final days.
He was tired.
Completely worn out.
He was drinking.
Needing the support that the brandy gave him.
He was obsessed by the fear that everything was bugged or targeted.
There was somebody who was trying to do us in.
There were malcontents in MI5 who were right-wing, malicious.
Nobody was trusted.
On March the 16th, 1976, Harold Wilson resigned as Prime Minister. He was just 2 years into his second term of office, and still only 60. His resignation stunned the nation. Extraordinary rumors began to circulate that some dark secret had forced him out of office. Israeli intelligence had a hold over him. An old sexual affair was about to be exposed. He was being blackmailed by the KGB. Throughout his second term, there was constant gossip about Harold Wilson. By its end, he had come to believe the world was full of secret enemies out to get him. 20 years on, important questions remain. Did Wilson become paranoid? Or was he genuinely the victim of plots, smears, and burglary? Did rumor and innuendo hasten his resignation and his physical and mental decline? With new evidence and new witnesses, we will unravel the mystery of Harold Wilson's final days.
So this is what 1964 can mean. A chance for change. More than that, a time for resurgence.
Last night I said these words to my girl. I know you never even tried, girl.
Harold Wilson was the political face of the swinging 60s.
Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart, but I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson. I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts. Silver! Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Harold.
He won the general elections of 1964 and 1966. But a year later, his government was knocked back when it was forced to devalue the pound. In a famous broadcast, Wilson tried to play down the damage.
From now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued.
In 1970, Wilson lost to the Conservatives under Edward Heath. But by early 1974, Britain was in crisis. The Tory government was under siege by the miners' strike. Heath called an election. Wilson entered the campaign as underdog.
Are you at all depressed that they thought that currently in the polls you apparently are sort of running third in the field of three?
Oh, rubbish. I know what's happening. There's been a big swing to us this week. The polls haven't caught up with.
In a dramatic finish, Wilson won by a whisker. For Mary Wilson, who had never wanted to be a Prime Minister's wife, it was a double-edged victory. The Wilsons never moved into Downing Street, staying put at their home in Westminster.
Harold had told us, and as he had also told Mary, that he was going to give it 2 years and no more. That was one of the things that reconciled Mary to his having a further spell as Prime Minister.
Still only 58, Wilson looked forward to a smooth and short final period of office. With a cabinet full of experience from his first administration, he would stay above the fray.
He liked to develop this role for himself of a centre-half who fed goals to other people. When he formed the cabinet with right-wingers, left-wingers, the centre, all the rest of it, I remember him saying to me, "I've buried all the hatchets, but I know where I've buried them and I can dig them up if necessary."
But from the start, hatchets were out. Not from his cabinet, but from forces outside. The first menace came from an unholy alliance between his political opponents and their allies in the press. Their target was the person whose wounding would most wound him, his long-term political secretary, Marcia Williams. While working at Labour's HQ in the 1950s, she'd spotted Wilson as Labour's rising star and went to work for him. Many believe her ambition and political acumen drove him to the top.
She was devoted to him. She shielded him from many people and had always unlimited access to him, and that, of course, made disliked, envied, and hated by people.
Gossip about Harold Wilson and Marcia Williams' relationship had long provided temptation for Wilson's opponents. In the 1964 election campaign, the Conservative Lord Hailsham, in response to the Profumo sex scandal which had rocked the Tories, made a wounding innuendo against them.
You talk to me about Profumo. If you can say honestly that there are no human failings on the front bench on the other side of the House.
Hailsham had made a speech attacking Harold Wilson and pretty well accusing him of adultery, and we know with whom. And those of us who were in the press caravan following him were told of the scenes that were going on in the room upstairs where Harold Wilson was in one corner puffing his pipe. Marcia was said to be in tears, and Mary was demonstrably unhappy.
In 1974, less than 2 months into his second term, Wilson decided to award Marcia Williams a peerage. His decision was bitterly opposed by the two key members of his inner circle, Bernard Donahue, head of the No. 10 Policy Unit, and his press officer, Joe Haynes.
I took a deputation to the Prime Minister, myself, Bernard Donahue, and Robert Armstrong, who was then the Principal Private Secretary. He waited outside the room because he was a civil servant, but willing to come in to give us any assistance. And we pleaded with Wilson not to go ahead with it because we thought of the harm it would do him. But he refused. He said that she was going to take a job outside of politics. And in the end, we accepted that as a price worth paying. But of course, nothing came of that.
In fact, Wilson had wavered. A furious row was overheard in Downing Street, during which Marcia Williams reminded him that he had promised her the peerage.
He certainly told me that he was under great pressure from her to do it, and therefore he would give way.
The peerage encouraged Wilson's opponents to go in search of scandal. In May 1974, a lunch took place in the quiet Hampshire village of Greywill. The venue was the Manor farmhouse. One guest was the Daily Express defence correspondent, Chapman Pincher, who for years had had close contacts inside MI5. Another guest was Sir Derek Rayner, who under the previous Conservative government had been head of procurement at the Ministry of Defence.
After the lunch, Derek said to me, "Now, Harry," the way I'm usually known to my friends, "tell us all the dirt from Fleet Street." So I realised I was there to sing for my supper at that particular moment, so I told them what was going on. The main thing at the time was Marcia's peerage.
Unknown to the wider world, Marcia Williams was now a single mother with 2 small children, from her relationship with the Daily Mail political journalist Walter Terry. Pincher told the Grey-Will lunch guests how even Labour politicians were worried that the wrong conclusions about the peerage would be drawn if this got out.
Everybody would wonder why he'd given it, and there were these 2 children, and there was all this fear that he would be thought to be the father, because Wilson and the rest in Number 10, of course, tried to hide the fact that she'd had them.
The Conservative leader, Edward Heath, had let it be known that he did not want such scandal to be published by the Tories' friends in the press. But by May 74, the Tories believed Wilson was about to call a second election, which they feared he would win easily. Chapman Pincher told the Grey-Will lunch party how he'd received a high-ranking visit in Fleet Street.
I was approached by an emissary, came to the office in Fleet Street and told me he'd come on behalf of Ted Heath. And the view was that the situation was now so bad that anything at all that would damage Labour would in fact be welcome.
The emissary, whom Pincher says encouraged him to use scandalous material, was Heath's brightest young aide.
I heard that emissary was William Waldegrave, is that right?
Yes, it was, yes. I never mentioned him before in a book, but it was William Waldegrave.
One guest at the lunch, the historian Martin Gilbert, became increasingly shocked by Pincher's story. He wrote to Heath. Heath replied, denying there'd ever been any suggestion of a Dirty Tricks campaign.
Later on, Waldegrave came to see me on his own initiative in the Express and apologised for the fact that his original visit had been denied. Now, it's possible that he was sent in the first instance by the Conservative office and that Ted was not informed. Though Ted may have been right in saying he knew nothing about it, but nevertheless it was true that I had been asked to do what I could to inflict as much damage on Wilson in particular in the pages of the Daily Express.
Martin Gilbert also wrote to Harold Wilson about the lunchtime gossip.
It was the letter to Wilson that was really important. It set him worrying because it was me and because I was associated with intelligence in MI5. He began to think that I was linked with MI5 and that MI5 was after him.
This letter, written in May 1974, was the first time Wilson and Lady Falkender suspected the intelligence services might be plotting against them. They began to see conspiracies at every turn. The summer of 1974 was an unstable time. In May, an intimidating strike by loyalists in Ulster brought down the power-sharing executive. Wilson saw the hand of subversion stoking loyalist fears.
I have to say that these fears are unfounded, that they are being deliberately fostered by people in search of power.
The army was unusually visible, mounting a series of anti-terrorist exercises around Heathrow Airport.
Marcia saw this as a possible military coup, and eventually she persuaded Harold that there was something in it.
Beneath the surface, private armies headed by former intelligence officers and generals were being formed to rescue the country when the far left finally took over. Also, hostile talk was taking place at MI5's headquarters in Mayfair. In the office safe of MI5's Director General, there existed a highly secret file on the Prime Minister himself, Harold Wilson. The file's code name was Henry Worthington. In it were reports stretching back 30 years. In the wrong hands, they could cause untold damage.
Mum! Just what you need, a house full of cardigans.
For an instant quote on your household insurance, phone NatWest. No forms, no fuss.
Thanks very much. Out, or I get the mint sauce.
Come on, chop, 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 chop. Out.
come on.
That's my jumper!
Call Nat West on 0800 24 24 25.
Now I ask you, who'd want to miss all this? If you haven't joined BT's Friends and Family scheme, then you're going to miss out on BT's fantastic offer of between 10 and 30% off British Airways flights. So hurry. If you're not a Friends and Family member, call BT, join now, it's free, and they'll send you a voucher. The number is 0800 05 55 55. What are you waiting for? There's a drink in here somewhere.
For an instant quote on household insurance, phone Nat West on 0800 24 24 25. No forms, no fuss.
Sagittarius, prepare yourself for upsets on the 2nd.
I did. How did they know it was my 2nd?
Have you seen my razor?
I think it's on the cabinet.
Okay. Whose is that?
Nothing to do with me.
What do you think you're playing at?
It's not mine. Don't look at me.
I thought we told you to be careful.
John, I think we're the ones who should have been careful.
There may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance.
If your family suddenly grows, so too will your responsibilities. That's why Allied Dunbar financial plans adapt, so you can face the unexpected.
Let's face the music and dance.
Allied Dunbar, for the life you don't yet know.
When we got home, we discovered the usual pocket full of leftover holiday money. Then we discovered we could sell it back to the place where we bought it. Who, we discovered, don't charge commission. Which, we discovered, gave us just enough for a delicious reminder of the time we'd had.
Once your holiday's over, Thomas Cook will buy back your leftover holiday money without charging commission. Thomas Cook. A little difference can make all the difference.
Ever since he first became Prime Minister, one part of the job had excited Harold Wilson above all others.
He was obsessed, and always was, by the secret world. If you gave a briefing from the Foreign Office about something to him, he would listen carefully. But then if you managed to produce an MI6 report, much more importance was attached to that. And it may only have come from some casual observer in a foreign country channel through a secret channel, but because it was secret, he thought it was very important. I think he was fascinated by this undercover cloak and dagger world.
What Harold Wilson did not know was that the secret world was equally fascinated with him. In fact, from the beginning of his political career, he'd been monitored by his own security service, MI5. Their reports had all gone into the Henry Worthington file. The reason? His links with Russia. Russia just after the war. A nation trying to rebuild. With the Cold War looming, many on the British left were determined to keep open the door to Stalin. In 1947, a Labour Party delegation visited Leningrad and Moscow. The delegation was even invited to meet the great man himself. The Labour MP's interpreter was a young diplomat, Oleg Troyanovsky.
After the conversation, one of them said, when they had left Stalin's house, he said, well, from now on, I will always think of him as good Uncle Joe.
Another visitor to Russia that year was the young Minister of Trade, Harold Wilson. He soon impressed the Russian leadership. Among those he met was Stalin's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. Once again, Oleg Troianovsky was present.
After the meeting, I recall Molotov saying, well, this is an up-and-coming young man. So apparently Wilson impressed him in one way or another.
In 1948, Wilson was made a cabinet minister, the youngest this century.
From Britain's great newspaper presses came the news of new leaders. 31-year-old Harold Wilson, here with his wife and son Robin, takes over as Board of Trade President, while Stafford Cripps...
He was a serious young man, even when it came to the burning issue of the length of women's skirts.
Oh, that old question. Well, it isn't for me to say how the long skirts and the short skirts look, though, of course, I have my own private views on that matter.
In 1951, Wilson made a key political move. Along with Aneurin Bevan, he resigned over the Attlee government's raising of defense spending and prescription charges. It made him the rising man of the left, but these were dangerous times to take such a position.
New York, and Julius Rosenberg arrives at the federal court to receive sentence for betraying his country's atomic secrets to Soviet Russia.
The Cold War had taken hold. Western intelligence services were on constant alert for communist sympathizers and agents. Despite the dangers, Wilson maintained his links with Russia. He became, for a Westerner, a frequent visitor to Moscow, his trips financed by the East-West Timber Trading Company, Montague Mayer, who'd hired him as a consultant. He developed his political contacts, meeting Trade Minister Anastas Mikoyan, Georgy Malenkov, who briefly succeeded Stalin, Nikolai Bulganin, Defense Minister and later Prime Minister, and Nikita Khrushchev. After Stalin's death, Wilson had the best contacts of any British or American senior politician with the new Soviet leadership. But in the secret world, this made him suspect.
It was the view in MI5 that anybody who'd ever been to Moscow, I think it was sort of more than 5 times, and I think that Harold was supposed to have been there about a dozen times, unaccompanied by his wife, was bound to have been the target of a KGB effort to compromise him in some way.
The MI5 logic was this: Wilson must have been approached by the KGB. But as he had never reported any approach, he was therefore covering it up. KGB officers speaking for the first time about Harold Wilson say this analysis was false.
The KGB, in spite of the myths, was sort of a second in command. The Central Committee of the Communist Party was high up. If he was just a tourist, he could be approached by the KGB. But he was considered to be one of the most promising politicians in Britain. You see, the KGB couldn't approach him so easily. Simply, they would not be allowed to do this.
He was meeting our government, and he had very high contacts. He used to meet Mikoyan and people in the Politburo, and that's why, there are certain limits.
Wilson stayed in Moscow's National Hotel. Like the few other Western visitors, he and his business activities were carefully monitored.
Everything was bugged. He was under very close surveillance, and all the negotiations between him and the timber company were scrutinized by the KGB.
As Wilson became a more familiar face in 1950s Moscow, the KGB was still barred from any direct approach. But a more subtle plan was hatched. As a first step, the KGB would offer to trade timber deals in exchange for political information.
The design was very simple: to use somehow his interest into some money and to interconnect it with his willingness to, maybe to share some information about the Labour Party. You see, to let him understand that it is interconnected. You see, this is, of course, it would be very slowly, not in a way I am telling you, but you see, the main proverb is here: the walk is slow, catch a monkey.
But in 1961, Wilson rejoined the Labour leadership as Shadow Foreign Secretary under Hugh Gaitskell. He gave up his consultancy with the timber company, and the KGB plan died. But MI5 suspicions lived on and was soon revived in a bizarre new twist.
The shadow of death hung over the house in Hampstead. Hugh Gaitskell, tragically early, has been taken from us in the prime of life.
In 1963, the Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell died of an unusual liver disease. Harold Wilson, then 46, was a front-runner to succeed him.
Isn't it going to be very important to elect his successor as quickly as possible?
I don't think we can begin to think about that yet. I mean, when the leader of the party has died only really a few hours ago, I don't think any of us can start thinking about that.
To Hampstead Parish Church went members of the family, also some of his friends in the Labour Party, for the solemn service.
Wilson defeated his arch-rival, George Brown, to succeed Gaitskell as Labour's leader. At the same time, MI5 was debriefing a Soviet defector called Anatoly Golitsyn. Together, Golitsyn and his MI5 handlers came up with an amazing story. Gaitskell, they said, had been murdered by the KGB to make way for Harold Wilson, whom they concluded was a long-term Soviet agent. Curiously, in his exhaustive debriefings with the CIA in America before he came to Britain, Golitsyn had never mentioned any such idea.
Golitsyn had been pretty much pumped dry. I'm absolutely certain that he knew nothing about Gaitskell or Wilson until he got to England in the summer of 1963. I think he learned about them there locally from his British colleagues, from the British officers who were working with him.
Golitsyn, I think, had never anything to do with the British desk or the Russian or Soviet intelligence against Britain. And that's why it's the assumption that he used to know everything was happening in Britain. It's ridiculous, really.
Golitsyn and his MI5 interrogators had woven rumor, false leads, and fantasy to create an extraordinary theory. But according to the KGB, MI5 must have known the theory was impossible.
Already in '59, and the British knew this perfectly well from their agents, already there was a decision of the political bureau of the Communist Party not to kill anybody. Not because they were very nice, simply because all the killers defected after that. You see? We killed our people, our agents, Russians abroad, white Russians, Ukrainian nationalists, and so on. But I don't remember a case when we killed some Western leader abroad. There was no case like this.
Yet the Gaitskell assassination theory found its true believers. The most fervent was MI5's then scientific expert, Peter Wright.
I had a very close relationship with Peter Wright myself in London. And Peter did tell me a lot of things which were very confidential. And one of them was about the Gaitskell Wilson business. And naturally, I was very interested in this and astonished to hear it.
When Golitsyn returned to America, he reported the new theory to the director of the CIA, John McCone.
McCone, you see, was shocked when he heard all this about Wilson being a possible suspect. And Gaitskell may have been murdered and so on. And he cabled Roger Hollis, then the Director General of MI5, and said, this is the first we've heard of this. This is what's going on?
Hollis cabled back to say the theory was untrue, but the damage had been done. It was adopted by CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who never let go of it. To the KGB, the idea that Wilson was an agent is outlandish.
He is very much like a fox. And I've met myself Wilson many times in the embassy and at some private parties. And, well, as I looked at him personally, I understood perfectly well that he is, as we say, unrecruitable person. Unrecruitable.
But 10 years later, in 1974, James Angleton and his supporters in MI5 were, unknown to Wilson, still telling their intelligence colleagues that he was a Soviet agent. In the secret world, reality was being confounded.
It's generally accepted practice for intelligence services throughout the world not to comment on the question of attribution of any person to intelligence service. But in this particular case, I want to make it absolutely clear that Harold Wilson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, had nothing to do with the KGB or Russian or Soviet intelligence then.
Far from cooperating with the KGB, Wilson was constantly haunted by the fear that they were after him. His cabinet secretary recalls the mounting paranoia, particularly on the visit they made to Russia in 1975.
He was obsessed by the fear that everything was bugged or targeted, and he would go to inordinate lengths to sort of turn on taps and lavatories and take you into corners to talk about things, and things that really didn't matter. It didn't matter whether the Russians were listening, you know, quite trivial things, but he had this obsession. And I think that led on to a feeling that if the KGB could be targeting him, well, so could the CIA and possibly MI5.
Some strange events had given Wilson reason to be disturbed. Someone had tried to smear his deputy, Ted Short, by sending to national newspapers a forged cheque, purporting to show he had a secret Swiss bank account.
We were convinced, in fact, that there was something going on outside. There was somebody who was trying to do us in. It made us very angry, and whether it sort of reduced our efficiency as ministers, I don't know. We tried not to let it do so, but it was there, of course, like a big black cloud hovering over us.
There'd been a spate of burglaries at the homes and offices of his staff and himself. Geoffrey Goodman was one of those burgled. Mysteriously, nothing was taken.
When I mentioned the burglary to Marcia, in fact, a few days later, and to one or two other people in number 10, they said to me, well, why should you be surprised? Why should you be omitted? We've all been burgled. And she said, you realize that there have been 13 or 14 burglaries of Harold's personal stuff in the last few months, and you're just added to the list.
No state secret was ever stolen. Underwear was stolen from one place. Grandfather clock was stolen from another. Old copies of Wilson's speeches I hadn't been able to give away when they were new were stolen. But there was nothing that was secret.
Wilson, a fierce opponent of apartheid, believed that agents from the South African embassy, probably working with MI5, were behind the burglaries.
When I was burgled twice in a week, and I lost my precious grandfather clock, and I told him, and he looked at me very straight, and he said, Bernard, it's probably in the South African embassy.
The obsession that he was being targeted began to dominate life at number 10.
The occasion when he pulled aside a portrait of Gladstone to reveal a hole in the wall with wires sticking out, which he thought proved that he was being bugged. All it was, on investigation, was that when the wall lights had been taken down to put the picture of Gladstone up in that position, the workman hadn't bothered to fill it in because the hole was being covered by the portrait.
Wilson was becoming paranoid. The man who had once been so enamored of the secret world was beginning to believe it had turned against him.
When I got rid of my grey hair, I wanted a natural look, so I didn't take any chances. I used a sure thing for a natural look called Just for Men.
Apply Just for Men and in 5 minutes rinse. Especially timed to blend away grey, bring back your natural look, and condition hair.
It's a sure thing.
Just for Men, a sure thing for a natural look.
Men, is grey hair in your moustache making you look too old? You need Just for Men gel. Brush in, rinse out. Grey's gone in just 5 minutes.
Deutsche Ingenieure stellen tolle Reifen her. Aber miese Dachterrassen. Continental Tires, German engineering where you need it most on a car.
You know, it's not just the new Renault Megane that talks your language. Renault Freeways does too. Renault Freeways is a brand new range of 3 finance offers. For instance, with Freeways 2, you can buy any Renault except special editions, and we'll pay your monthly repayments for you until 1997. So now there's just one thing to do. Choose the one you want. Renault Freeways, your best route yet to a new Renault.
Hotpoint has designed a fridge freezer unlike any other. As you'd expect, it's completely frost-free. But the really clever thing is, it has an extra cubic foot of space on the inside. And it comes in 7 different colors on the outside, making a Hotpoint Mistral Plus ideal for any kitchen.
Orange believe you shouldn't be rushed into anything, which is why we offer a 14-day money-back guarantee. The future's bright. The future's orange.
Isn't it about time we stopped trying to do everything and gave more consideration to more important things? To make time to do things well, we have to decide to do less. That is why at the Bristol & West, we specialize only in the more important financial matters. Mortgages, savings, investments, and nothing else.
In October 1974, Harold Wilson won his 4th general election. A few weeks later, on the way to an economic summit with the French president Giscard d'Estaing, came the first signs of the ill health which would increasingly plague him.
He had a heart tremble in the plane going over. And when he arrived, Rambouillet, his doctor decided that it would be best if Wilson cut short his stay at the economic summit, which he did. Nobody, as far as I know, not even Giscard, knew the truth.
I had to issue a bogus story that Wilson was suffering from flu. He wasn't, he was completely worn out. And yet he was not doing more than he had done before, it's just that the mental strain was much greater.
There were other signs of strain. One showed itself on the eve of an important meeting with the German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt.
He told me he didn't feel well enough to go. He had what he called the squitters. Several times after that, when he was meeting international statesmen or dealing with a really major issue, these so-called squitters would return.
Yet another strain was the continuing infighting between his inner court of advisers, Haynes, Donahue, and Lady Falkender.
It was very tense and suspicious. Outbursts of temper and screams and general hostilities. So one felt one's shoulder blades were permanently exposed.
Particularly when one travelled overseas and was thus living with the Prime Minister sort of more or less 24 hours a day, one was conscious of the strain which some of the arguments between members of the court and their appeals to him put on him personally. I mean, it was undoubtedly a factor in the strain which I think he felt at that time.
Haynes and Donahue blamed Lady Falkender for unduly burdening the Prime Minister.
One example of her power in the relationship was, I remember, came back from a foreign visit and she had telephoned before he left to say she wished to see him at the airport. And when we landed, she was not yet there. And he waited, and we and the rest of the staff all went home. And she kept him waiting for about an hour at Heathrow. He was Prime Minister of Great Britain. Not everybody would keep him waiting that long.
But the greatest strain of all was an extraordinary story beginning to emerge, that inside number 10, a communist cell was at work. Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. From here, in 1968, this man arrived at the Russian embassy in London.
I came to London as the head of the consular department. This was my cover position.
His name was Richard Vagauskas.
During the daytime I was doing my job as the head of the consular department, late afternoon as a KGB officer.
In London, the KGB man was introduced to a fellow Lithuanian who'd come to Britain after the war and made a fortune.
He's a big man, a nice gentleman, and a big businessman. And I guess I made a telephone call to him.
The big man was Sir Joseph Kagan, manufacturer of Ganex raincoats and friend of the Prime Minister, who had made them famous. After the war, Kagan had set up his factory in Harold Wilson's hometown of Huddersfield and cultivated the up-and-coming Labour politician. Wilson was always keen to help his friend. When he visited Russia in 1963, after he'd become leader of the opposition, he tried to persuade the Soviet president, Anastas Mikoyan, to do business with Kagan.
He came to our country house, we had tea, and he took with him a raincoat, a beige one from outside, and like a Scotch blanket from inside. He was trying to convince my father to buy many raincoats from that factory, or to have a joint venture with that company in Russia.
Kagan had long been under suspicion by the MI5 CIA duo of Peter Wright and James Angleton because of his Soviet bloc links. Cleveland Cram later saw Angleton's file on Kagan.
The file was most peculiar. There was nothing in it, virtually, except some notes that Jim had taken in his very fine script, and then this one memo about Kagan. And the memo said, in effect, this is what we've learned. There is nothing recorded about him in the records. No defectors have produced anything about Kagan. The only thing we found about Kagan is this item from the British Who's Who.
But Richard Vagauskas' friendship with Kagan would give Wilson's opponents in MI5 a new opportunity. In London, Kagan and Vagauskas discovered a common pursuit: chess. They did each other favors. Vagauskas opened trade doors and helped Kagan get permission for Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union. In return, Kagan introduced him to some of his British friends. But Vagauskas met Wilson just once, at an official party at the Soviet Trade Mission.
I met Harold Wilson there. I guessed that we shook hands, and I introduced myself. I'm head of the consular department, and that's all.
The friendship between Kagan and Vagauskas could hardly have been more open.
If he telephoned me, I telephoned him. You know that any KGB officer, if he is collaborating or he gets his agent, he never will make a official telephone call from his office, never. My approach to Joseph, I really loved the gentleman, and I would never try to force him to collaborate with me, never.
But for the men from MI5, the connection was a godsend. Watching Vagauskas from a flat opposite the Russian embassy, they finally had, in intelligence terms, a contact. Vagauskas, a KGB man, knew Kagan. Kagan was a friend of Wilson. Kagan was also in regular contact with Lady Falkender, herself suspect to MI5 because she'd accompanied Wilson to Russia. It took only one small imaginative leap for MI5 to conclude that there was a communist cell in Downing Street. By mid-1975, stories about the number 10 communist cell were circulating in London. Some of Wilson's friends thought he should be warned.
There was no question that a lot of people in his entourage converged from different, from different sides, and telling him there was this whispering going on, the propaganda against him.
He began to wonder, could MI5 or could people in MI5 be targeting him? And one went through very carefully with him the procedures, the warrant system for interception and bugging and all the rest of it. But as in all these things, you have to trust somebody.
That somebody, advised the Cabinet Secretary, could only be the Director General of MI5 himself, Sir Michael Handley. Hunt arranged for Wilson to see him.
I think it was very important that he formed his own view of the head of the Security Service and to discuss with him how things were run, how they were controlled, how people were targeted, and what possibilities there might be for people behaving in an improper manner.
Wilson was not reassured by the meeting. Worried about threats from everywhere, he summoned a close friend to the House of Commons and asked him to undertake a special mission.
He said, look, I understand you're going to Washington on business and you will be seeing my friend Hubert Humphrey, who was also a friend of mine, and George Bush, who was then just about to take on the job as director of the CIA. And I made informal soundings and said, look here, there's all this talk about how Wilson and insinuations that the American CIA has it in it for him, that he's not loyal to the Western Alliance. Can you find out for me what really is the case?
Bush told Weidenfeld the Americans held Wilson in high esteem and had no doubts about his ultimate loyalty to the West. Bush even made a special visit to London to reassure the Prime Minister.
He asked George Bush, who was then head of the CIA, whether the CIA were targeting him. And I think for then good measure, he probably asked George Bush whether he thought MI5 were targeting him. I mean, it was, as I say, almost an obsession. This obsession that he was being spied on and conspired against reached right into Downing Street. I mean, nobody was trusted.
Weighed down by so many pressures, Wilson was drinking heavily, not the public pint, but in private, up to a bottle of brandy a day.
I was advised by his secretary that the best time to see him, if I wanted to see the Prime Minister, if I wanted to have a talk with him, best time would certainly be before lunch, because in the afternoon, certainly the later afternoon, after he dealt with parliamentary questions, then his mood would be uncertain.
When he did Prime Minister's questions on a Tuesday and Thursday, he required 3, even occasionally 4 neat brandies. There was one occasion when the Speaker allowed the questions to run on a quarter of an hour longer than the allotted time, and I told him afterwards that his voice was distinctly slurred, and he said, oh, it's that bloody Speaker. Shouldn't have let the questions go on. But in fact he knew that he shouldn't have drunk that amount.
In November 1975, Wilson asked Joe Haynes to draw up a secret timetable for his resignation. At the outset, Wilson had told a few confidants he would only serve 2 years. But by the end, even if he wanted to go on, there was no turning back. He was a broken man, physically, mentally, and politically.
I remember very well, outside the cabinet room, he'd come out of a cabinet meeting and he looked very down and he said to me, you know, Bernard, I'm bored with all of this. I've been round this racecourse so many times and jumped all the jumps. He said, I cannot get interested in jumping any more obstacles again. And he just looked very low and wandered off up the stairs. And one knew then he was ready to go.
He'd been to the palace, and he then came to the cabinet, and you looked at their faces round that room, and they were absolutely struck dumb. And at the end of it, there was silence. And then I think it was Ted Short or Lord Chancellor or both who sort of said a few words, but they really were struck dumb, and at any rate, one of them was weeping.
There has always been further speculation about the timing of Wilson's announcement. Had he already been diagnosed as suffering from the brain illness which was to mar his old age? One clue can be found in a conversation he had with family friend Dorothy White shortly after his resignation.
And then I said to him, Harold, why on earth are you resigning? And he said, well, it's because I no longer have the same control over my mind. And I said your mind was always so much better than anyone else's that surely a slight difficulty isn't really a good reason for resigning. And he said, no, I didn't really understand that his mind was not as it had been, and he thought it was not right that he should continue as Prime Minister, and also that he wanted to be able to write his memoirs.
It's, I think, to his eternal credit that he actually recognised it. He knew that he was not the man he was, and he was determined not to cling to office. In a way, the manner of his going became him as much as anything he ever did, because he knew he could no longer do the job.
A year after he resigned, Wilson, in a series of bizarre conversations, encouraged two journalists to go in search of MI5 conspiracies. He told them, I see myself as the big fat spider in the corner of the room. Sometimes I speak when I'm asleep. You should both listen. When the journalists published Wilson's concerns, there was a furore, and he himself was widely ridiculed. But the conspiracy stories did prompt Wilson's successor, James Callaghan, to set up a discreet internal inquiry into MI5. The results showed an inbuilt reactionary bias.
I think the whole process of conducting that sort of inquiry did open up the question of what sort of people were the Security Service recruiting, and it became very apparent that it was all done very much on an old boy basis.
Peter Wright was one MI5 old boy. A decade later, he claimed there had been plots in MI5 against Wilson, though he gave widely differing accounts of their scale. So what is the truth? We have found a friend of Peter Wright who regularly commuted with him to London during the actual period in question. On their return journey, they used to drop by at the Albert pub in Witham, Essex, for an after-work drink. One night, Peter Wright unburdened himself to his friend, a former MI6 man, Desmond Bristow. First, he talked about MI5 suspicions of Wilson's friends.
So he said, well, Hal Wilson, just like I had some very some funny chaps around him. So I said, well, like who? He said, well, you know, that raincoat man.
Then Peter Wright made a startling admission.
He said there's 3 or 4 chaps in the office who seemed determined to stir up the apple cart and get at Wilson. He never mentioned any names, quite rightly. And then he said, well, I'm getting more and more involved in it, and I'm getting into a situation which I don't like at all. And then the press seemed to be getting involved, and he'd met 1 or 2 of them. Again, no names.
Leaking of secret information by MI5 is not just a breach of security, but also an illegal act. MI5 has never admitted any wrongdoing during Harold Wilson's second term. Indeed, it was officially cleared in parliamentary statements by Prime Ministers James Callaghan in 1977 and Margaret Thatcher in 1987. But 20 years on, the Cabinet Secretary during this extraordinary period, the most senior civil servant of his time, gives a definitive verdict.
There is absolutely no doubt at all that a very few, malcontents in MI5, people who shouldn't have been there in the first place, a lot of them, like Peter Wright, who were right-wing, malicious, had serious personal grudges, were giving vent to these and spreading damaging, malicious stories about some members of that Labour government.
This is the first time a top-level insider has acknowledged that Harold Wilson's second term was marred by MI5-inspired smears. But the MI5 dissidents were remarkably unsuccessful. Apart from some snide pieces in the satirical magazine Private Eye, their far-fetched stories about Wilson did not get published. As for the Henry Worthington file, Peter Wright later claimed he had been asked by the MI5 dissidents to steal it from the Director General's safe, but that he had refused. There is no evidence that the file ever got out. After he left office, Wilson succumbed to the brain disease which was gradually erasing his legendary memory. He became the forgotten Prime Minister.
He had no money, you know, so he could have retired and started the lucrative lecture tours that other Prime Ministers since have gone on. But unfortunately, by the time he did retire and the lecture tours began, his mind was going.
Harold Wilson died last year at the age of 79. Ultimately, he became a victim of his own obsession. He saw secret enemies everywhere. Some did exist, but they were never a real threat to himself or the state. A more robust Prime Minister would have shrugged them off, but by the end, weighed down by so many different pressures and his own frailties, Wilson allowed them to break him.